The early 20th century became a period of turmoil for Italy, eventually giving rise to a crisis of the country's liberal democracy and resulting in the rise of fascism. This new kind of right-wing politics eventually shaped the world order in disastrous ways. Italy's political life in the 19th century was dominated by a liberal centrism, which worked to prevent the left or right from becoming a strong political challenge to the status quo. This approach, known as trasformismo, tried to ensure stable parliamentary coalitions between political rivals through informal agreements and bribery. One of the famous critics of the system was Francesco Crispi, who called it parliamentary incest, until he himself adopted the strategy. Another political figure associated with this era was Giovanni Giolitti. He was destined to live to see the downfall of this political system. By the early 20th century, while the north of the country had industrialized, the south remained backward and agrarian by comparison, with organized crime networks such as the famous mafia remaining strong. The First World War was about to upset the old ways forever. Emerging from World War I on the side of the victorious Western Allies, yet deeply scarred, Italy, like other countries, grappled with economic turmoil, social unrest, and political instability. Amid this chaos, a new political force emerged, one that would reshape Italy's destiny: fascism. In this video, we will explore the social and political causes behind the rise of fascism in Italy, the circumstances that enabled Benito Mussolini to seize power, and how propaganda and violence played pivotal roles. Italy's participation in World War I was both costly and controversial. Despite being on the side of the victors, Italy felt shortchanged at the Paris Peace Conference, receiving less territorial gains than anticipated. This sentiment was encapsulated by the term mutilated victory, coined by nationalist poet Gabriele D'Annunzio. The idea of a mutilated victory and of being denied its rightful place in the post-war order became a theme for the far right to play with. Romantic nationalism, which idealized the nation's past and future glory, gained momentum. Figures like D'Annunzio offered a vision of Italy which, they hoped, would rekindle the spirit of the Roman Empire. Such sentiments resonated deeply with the population yearning for pride and stability. As countries demobilized after the First World War, hundreds of thousands of troops had to be integrated back into civilian life. Brutalized by the violence of the Great War, a number of former soldiers in countries like Italy and Germany became involved in far-right movements. In Italy, during the First World War, new assault units had been raised to break the stalemate of trench warfare. Trained to disregard their own safety, these troops, known as arditi, came to be idealized by the Italian far-right after the war. Although thousands of arditi also joined the socialist left, it was the far-right which capitalized the most on their image. Figures like D'Annunzio adopted the image of the arditi soldiers, associating them with the slogan, "Me ne frego," I don't care. This slogan came to represent the willingness of the far-right to combine romantic nationalism with nihilistic violence. In 1919, D'Annunzio led a paramilitary occupation of Fiume, now Rijeka, defying the Italian government and international treaties. This act symbolized the power of nationalist fervor and set a precedent for fascist tactics. Benito Mussolini began his political journey as a socialist, editing the party newspaper Avanti. But his pro-war stance pitted him against the anti-war views of the mainstream socialist movement, which saw the First World War as a conflict where working-class people were being sacrificed as soldiers for the interests of a few capitalists in each country. Mussolini's support for Italy's involvement in the war led to him being expelled from the Socialist Party. In 1919, capitalizing on the nation's turmoil, he founded the Fasci Italiani di Combattimento, blending nationalist and socialist ideologies. In the beginning, Mussolini was disappointed by the slow growth of his far-right movement. He even considered giving up and emigrating out of Italy to become a fiction writer, but his political fortunes were about to change. far-right forces began taking advantage of the ruling class's intense fear of the socialist left. In Italy, the post-war period, known as the Biennio Rosso, 2 red years, saw a surge in socialist and anarchist movements. Workers seized factories and peasants occupied lands, inspired by the recent Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. Antonio Gramsci, a Marxist theorist and leader, emphasized the need for workers to assert control over society and build a new future. However, the ruling classes perceived these movements as threats to their status and were haunted by fears of a communist takeover. A wave of strikes and factory occupations by socialist workers further persuaded industrialists and landowners to provide financial support to the fascist movement. Mussolini's charisma and adaptability allowed him to attract diverse supporters, from disgruntled war veterans to the middle classes fearing socialist movements. The fascist squads, known as black shirts, used violence to suppress socialist and communist activities. These paramilitary groups, often war veterans seeking purpose, intimidated opponents and disrupted leftist organizations. Newspapers and critical voices also found themselves targeted by the fascist squads. The squads beat people, murdered others, burned down houses and other buildings, and forced critics into public acts of humiliation. Many liberal politicians turned a blind eye to fascist violence, viewing it as a bulwark against socialism. Unwilling or unable to build a coalition with the left, they instead tried to make concessions to Mussolini, hoping that this would prevent further demands for power. But Mussolini and his followers were growing more and more assertive. In October 1922, Mussolini orchestrated the March on Rome, a show of force aimed at seizing power. While the actual threat was limited, the psychological impact was immense. King Victor Emmanuel III, fearing civil war and doubting the existing government's ability to maintain order, invited Mussolini to form a government. Mussolini's calculated gamble paid off, marking his ascent as Italy's prime minister. While the fascists had used violence to rise, Mussolini sought to legitimize his system through legal means. The Acerbo Law of 1923 restructured the electoral system, granting a 2/3 majority in parliament to the party with at least 25% of votes. Critics like Piero Gobetti recognized fascism's deep roots in Italian society and the complicity of the liberal establishment. In 1924, socialist parliamentarian Giacomo Matteotti openly denounced fascist electoral fraud. Shortly after, he was kidnapped and murdered by fascist thugs. The assassination sparked outrage, threatening Mussolini's position. However, through a combination of political maneuvering and further suppression, he weathered the crisis. In January 1925, Mussolini assumed responsibility for fascist actions, signaling the transition to outright dictatorship. Propaganda became a cornerstone of fascist rule through art, media, and education. The regime cultivated an image of Mussolini as the embodiment of Italy's resurgence. Children were indoctrinated from a young age, taught to revere il duce and uphold fascist ideals. The regime systematically dismantled opposition. Press freedom was curtailed, political parties banned, and critics imprisoned or exiled. Mussolini introduced the concept of corporatism, where the economy was organized into sectors called corporations. Each corporation represented workers, employers, and the state in a specific sector of the economy. These corporations were supposed to mediate disputes and ensure harmony, but in practice, they suppressed workers' rights. The regime brutally suppressed socialist, communist, and anarchist movements, which were seen as threats to fascist ideology. Workers' unions were dismantled or absorbed into the state-controlled corporatist system, eliminating independent labor movements. The main organization representing Italian industrialists and large businesses was the Confindustria. Early in Mussolini's rise to power, Confindustria cooperated with the fascist regime, largely because the fascists suppressed the socialist and communist movements, which industrialists saw as threats to their interests. Fascist Italy emphasized mass mobilization, organizing grand rallies and sporting events to foster unity and showcase strength. Organizations like the Opera Nazionale Balilla for youth and the Fasci Femminili for women aimed to integrate all facets of society into the fascist project. The regime invested heavily in public works and infrastructure projects, such as building roads, bridges, and draining marshlands. These projects aimed to reduce unemployment and modernize Italy, but they were also propaganda tools to showcase the regime's achievements. Antonio Gramsci, one of fascism's most famous critics, was arrested in 1926. During his imprisonment, he penned the prison notebooks, analyzing the cultural and ideological foundations of fascist power. For socialists, fascist violence was seen as a counter-revolutionary project whose primary target was labor and socialist movements. In their analysis, fascist violence was backed by the urban and rural elites and found support from middle classes, which feared becoming reduced to working-class status. In this way, they saw fascism as a violent response to the crisis of capitalism and the challenge represented by socialist and communist parties. Fascism's rise in Italy was the product of post-war disillusionment, nationalist fervor, class conflict, and political opportunism. Through a blend of propaganda, violence, and legal manipulation, Mussolini was able to smash liberal democratic institutions and replace them with the rule of his fascist party.